My name is Natalie. I am 33 years old, and I stood in the foyer of my $2.5 million Beacon Hill brownstone, staring at my father and stepmother as they barged through my front door with a team of movers. They smirked and told me to pack my bags because the house belonged to them now. They tried to evict me from the very home my late grandmother left me, waving a forged document in my face. What they forgot was that I am a senior partner in real estate litigation. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to take everything you worked for. It was a quiet Saturday morning in Boston. 3 months had passed since my beloved grandmother Clara passed away. I was sitting in the historic parlor, sipping my black coffee and looking at the antique grandfather clock she loved so much. I was trying to find some peace in the memories we shared in this beautiful home. Then the heavy, aggressive pounding on my front door started. It was not a polite knock from a neighbor. It was the loud, demanding sound of someone who believed they owned the place. I set my coffee cup down, walked down the hallway, and pulled the heavy oak door open. I found my father Richard standing on my porch. He is 62 years old, but his face carried the exact same arrogant scowl I remembered from my painful childhood. Standing right next to him was my stepmother, Brenda. She is 55 years old and was dressed in a ridiculous designer tracksuit that she clearly thought made her look wealthy and important. Right behind them stood my 28-year-old half-sister, Brittany. She was holding her phone high in the air, already recording everything for her social media followers. Beside her was her husband, Jamal. Jamal is 31, an African-American tech bro who constantly brags about his startup companies that never actually seem to generate any real profit. But the real shock was not just my estranged family showing up completely uninvited. It was the 4 burly movers standing right behind them, carrying 10 heavy cardboard boxes packed with their personal belongings. Before I could even ask what was going on, Brenda pushed her way right past me. She stepped directly into my foyer, looking around the elegant space with a sneer of absolute disgust on her face. "You need to pack your cheap bags and get out," Brenda announced, her voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. "This is your father's house now." I stood there, frozen, not from fear but from the sheer audacity of her words. Brittany shoved past me next, not even bothering to lower her phone. She was live streaming to her followers, loudly complaining about the vintage wallpaper and saying the place needed a complete modern makeover. Jamal walked in right after her. He did not even look at me or say hello. Instead, he pulled a digital laser measuring tape out of his pocket and began pointing it at the walls of my historic parlor. The little red dot danced across the original 19th century mahogany panels that my grandmother had spent decades meticulously preserving. "This space is decent," Jamal said loudly to Brittany, completely ignoring my presence. "If we gut these old panels and tear down that stone fireplace, we can build you a state-of-the-art podcast studio right here in the center of the room. It will have perfect acoustics once we rip out this outdated hardwood flooring." I watched him casually plot the complete destruction of my grandmother Clara's most cherished room. The disrespect was absolutely suffocating. I finally found my voice, pushing past the initial shock. "What are you doing in my house?" I demanded, stepping firmly between Jamal and the fireplace. "You need to tell these movers to leave my property right now." My father Richard scoffed loudly. He slowly walked inside, looking at me like I was a stubborn tenant who was refusing to pay rent. He reached inside his expensive tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He threw it casually onto the antique entryway table. It landed with a soft slap against the polished wood. "You do not own anything here, Natalie," he said, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "Read it and weep. Your grandmother finally came to her senses before she died and gave the property to the rightful head of the family." I looked down at the crumpled paper on the table. Across the top, printed in bold black letters, were the words, "Quit Claim Deed." It alleged that Clara had transferred the entire property to Richard just weeks before her passing. I picked up the document. My hands were perfectly steady. I spend my days analyzing complex property disputes, untangling corporate fraud, and destroying forged contracts in federal court. I did not panic. I simply read the paper in front of me. My father stood there crossing his arms, fully expecting me to break down crying. Brenda was smirking from the kitchen doorway, clearly enjoying what she thought was the ultimate victory over the stepdaughter she had always deeply hated. Jamal was still measuring the walls, acting like the eviction was already finalized. Brittany was posing for her camera, narrating her triumph to strangers online. But as my eyes scanned the page, my highly trained legal mind immediately went to work, breaking down their pathetic attempt at theft, piece by piece, preparing for war. I knew exactly how to handle this totally insane and ridiculous situation with absolute precision. Every detail on that forged paper was a glaring mistake. I took a slow breath and decided to let them think they had actually won. This would be the biggest mistake of their lives. I held the piece of paper in my hands, keeping my face entirely blank. On the surface, I looked like a woman whose entire world was collapsing. But inside my head, my mind shifted into a sharp, cold, and highly analytical focus. I am a senior partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in Boston, and my specific area of expertise happens to be real estate litigation. I spend my days tearing apart fraudulent contracts and exposing property scams in federal court. It took me exactly 3 seconds to spot the glaring errors on the document they had so confidently thrown onto my entryway table. First of all, the signature was a complete joke. My grandmother Clara had a very distinct, elegant way of writing her name. The loop on the capital C in her signature always swooped downward in a specific, sharp angle. The signature on this quitclaim deed was clumsy, shaky, and the C was completely rounded. It looked like someone had tried to trace it from an old birthday card. Secondly, the notary stamp pressed onto the bottom right corner of the page was completely invalid. The expiration date on the notary seal was from 2 years ago. In the state of Massachusetts, an expired notary stamp renders a property transfer document completely legally void upon arrival. Finally, the formatting of the legal description was entirely wrong for a historic Beacon Hill property. It lacked the necessary lot boundaries and registry book references that any first-year law student would know to include. It was a pathetic, amateurish forgery. My stepmother Brenda likely found a template online, printed it out, and had Richard forge the signature, while assuming I would be too stupid to notice. For a split second, I considered pulling out my phone and calling the Boston police right then and there. I could easily have them arrested for trespassing and escorted off my property in handcuffs. But the analytical side of my brain immediately stopped me. If I called the police right now, it would just be a simple trespassing dispute. They would be forced to leave, but they would probably just get a slap on the wrist. They would claim it was a family misunderstanding. I did not want a simple misunderstanding. I wanted them completely destroyed. I wanted them to face federal consequences for what they were trying to do to my grandmother Clara and her legacy. To catch a rat, you have to leave the cheese on the trap. So I decided to play along. I let my shoulders slump forward, deliberately dropping my posture to make myself look small and defeated. I forced my hands to shake slightly as I placed the forged deed back onto the mahogany table. I looked up at my father with wide, devastated eyes, playing the exact role of the submissive, broken daughter that he always wanted me to be. "You cannot be serious," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "Grandma Clara promised this house to me. She told me it was mine." Richard laughed, a harsh and booming sound that filled the foyer. "People say a lot of things before they die, Natalie," he sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "But the ink on this paper is what matters." She realized that leaving a multi-million-dollar estate to a single, lonely woman who cares more about legal briefs than starting a family was a massive waste of resources. "This house belongs to the head of the family now." Brittany shoved her phone camera closer to my face, capturing my fake devastation for her live stream. "See, guys?" Brittany announced to her followers with a cruel giggle. "This is what happens when you are selfish your whole life. You end up with absolutely nothing." Jamal did not even look up from his laser measuring tape. He was already shouting dimensions to Brittany, talking about knocking down load-bearing walls, as if I was already gone. Brenda stepped closer to me, her heavy perfume making me want to gag. She crossed her arms and looked me up and down with pure disdain. "You have exactly 20 minutes to pack your cheap clothes and get out of our house," she commanded. "Do not try to take any of the antique furniture or the silver. It all belongs to us now. If you are not out of here in 20 minutes, I will have Jamal physically throw you out onto the street." I let out a fake sob, nodding submissively. "Okay," I whispered, keeping my head down. "I will pack my things. Please just give me a minute." I turned around and walked up the grand staircase, letting them hear my dramatic sniffles. As soon as I reached the second-floor landing and was out of their sight, my tears vanished completely. My face hardened into a mask of pure determination. I walked into my master bedroom and pulled a small leather overnight bag from the closet. I did not pack much. I threw in a few changes of clothes and some basic toiletries. The only things I truly cared about were my work laptop, my secure encrypted hard drives, and the heavy, fireproof lockbox hidden in the back of my closet. That lockbox contained the true, original certified documents regarding the house documents that proved their quitclaim deed was not just a fake, but an absolute legal impossibility. I zipped my bag shut and walked back downstairs. My father was pouring himself bourbon from the antique crystal decanter. Jamal and Brittany were taking selfies nearby. Brenda complained loudly that the crown molding looked old. I walked silently to the front door. I paused with my hand on the brass doorknob, looking back at them celebrating. They were completely unaware that the entire house was equipped with hidden smart home surveillance cameras linked directly to my phone. I smiled, knowing they had just walked directly into my carefully laid trap. I wait. I pulled the heavy front door shut behind me, the sharp click of the lock echoing in the crisp Boston air. Stepping down the stone stairs, I did not look back. I walked directly to my car, placed my leather overnight bag on the passenger seat, and drove away from Beacon Hill. The drive was short, but it gave me the exact amount of time I needed to completely compartmentalize the anger burning in my chest. I checked into a luxury hotel downtown, securing a corner suite that would serve as my temporary command center for the next few days. As soon as the bellhop left my room, I locked the door, took off my coat, and sat at the large mahogany desk. I opened my laptop and immediately synced it to my phone. With a few quick keystrokes, the high-definition security feeds from my house filled the large screen. I had installed these discrete cameras months ago for security purposes, after some packages went missing in the neighborhood. Placing them in the foyer, the historic parlor, the kitchen, and the main hallways, they were practically invisible, disguised as smoke detectors and integrated into the smart home system. Now, they were broadcasting a crystal-clear live feed of my family, staging their hostile takeover. I watched the screen intently. In the parlor, Brittany was holding a massive bottle of expensive champagne, laughing loudly as she popped the cork. The foam sprayed all over the antique Persian rug my grandmother had brought back from her travels. Seeing Brittany act so entitled in my home triggered a very specific and painful memory. When I was 18 years old, my father had physically thrown all my belongings into the hallway to kick me out of my childhood bedroom so Brittany could have a massive walk-in closet. He had coldly told me that it did not matter because I only cared about boring books anyway, while my sister needed the space to prepare for her important social life. I pushed that bitter memory aside and focused on the present reality. Their celebration was entirely premature. They believed they had outsmarted me, but they had absolutely no idea how the law actually worked. I opened a new secure tab on my browser and logged directly into my law firm encrypted database. As a senior partner, I have high-level clearance and direct access to the county registry of deeds and the state property tracking systems. I needed to ensure that Richard and Jamal could not do any immediate financial damage using that forged piece of paper. They might try to sell the property quickly to an unsuspecting cash buyer, or they might try to use it as collateral. I was not going to let them profit from my grandmother legacy for even a single second. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I rapidly drafted an emergency injunction. This specific legal maneuver is a powerful tool in real estate litigation. It places a hard, silent freeze on the property title. I attached my certified proof of identity and my sworn affidavit as the property rightful owner. I routed the emergency filing directly through the automated electronic court system, flagging it for immediate judicial review based on suspected fraudulent conveyance. Because it was a weekend, the full judicial review would be processed first thing on Monday morning, but the preliminary electronic hold took effect instantly. A digital lock was now firmly placed on the deed. If Jamal or Richard tried to run that forged document through any legitimate title company or real estate agency, red flags would instantly pop up across the entire banking system. The beauty of this specific injunction was its complete silence. The state does not send an automatic email or a warning letter to the people attempting the fraud. Richard and his crew would have absolutely no idea the property was frozen until they actually tried to execute a legal transaction. They were effectively trapped inside a financial cage of their own making, and I was holding the only key. I leaned back in my ergonomic hotel chair and took a deep breath, feeling the tension slowly leave my shoulders. I watched the live camera feed again. Jamal was now in the kitchen, aggressively opening cabinets and complaining about the vintage hardware. Brenda was walking through the hallway, pointing at my grandmother classic oil paintings and making throwing motions with her hands, clearly planning to discard them. My father was sitting in my favorite leather armchair, drinking my expensive bourbon, looking incredibly smug and satisfied with himself. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally put the boring, bookish daughter in her proper place. What they failed to realize was that real estate fraud is a highly complex web, and by physically occupying the property with a forged document, they were establishing a documented timeline of criminal intent. Every step they took inside my house, every wall they measured, every conversation they had about the property was currently being recorded by my smart home system and uploaded to a secure cloud server. I did not just want to kick them out. If I simply proved the deed was fake today, they would just claim they were victims of a bad notary and walk away without any real consequences. They would go back to their comfortable lives and try to find another sneaky way to completely ruin mine. I needed them to commit fully to the crime. I needed them to take an action so legally damning that they could never escape the severe consequences. I poured myself a glass of cold water, keeping my eyes fixed on the glowing monitor. I was fully prepared to watch them like a hawk. I was entirely prepared to let them dig their own graves, shovel by shovel, until the hole was far too deep for them to ever climb out. This was just the very beginning of their absolute and total destruction. I sat in the complete silence of my hotel room, highly focused, and ready for the incoming legal battle that would permanently change all of their lives forever. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of my hotel suite, waking me from a surprisingly restful sleep. I ordered black coffee from room service and immediately opened my laptop to check the overnight surveillance feeds. The house was quiet, but my phone suddenly buzzed on the nightstand. It was a social media notification. Brittany had just gone live on Instagram to her 200,000 followers. I mirrored my phone to my laptop screen and hit the screen record button, ensuring I captured every single second of her broadcast. Brittany was standing in the center of my grand foyer, wearing a designer silk robe and holding a steaming mug of expensive matcha. "Welcome to our new multi-million-dollar Boston home, you guys," she announced, flashing a brilliant artificial smile at the camera. "Jamal and I are absolutely thrilled to finally move into this gorgeous historic brownstone in Beacon Hill. It has been such a massive transition, but we are so blessed to take over this estate." She flipped the camera around to show off the grand mahogany staircase and the intricate crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling. I watched in cold silence as she paraded through the rooms my grandmother had so lovingly maintained for decades. Brittany strutted into the historic parlor, pointing her manicured finger at the antique fireplace. "We are totally gutting this entire room," she told her followers. "It is super outdated and way too stuffy. We are building a high-tech studio space right here. Jamal has huge plans for his startup, and we need an environment that matches our modern, visionary lifestyle." The live chat was scrolling rapidly, with her followers sending heart emojis and asking how she managed to secure such an incredible property at her young age. Brittany paused, leaning against the doorframe with a look of practiced fake sympathy. "Well, honestly, you guys, it is a bit of a sad family situation," she sighed, lowering her voice to sound dramatic. "My older sister was living here before us, but she is 33 and completely single. She just could not afford to keep the place or manage the massive upkeep by herself." I gripped my coffee cup tightly as I listened to her spin this ridiculous web of lies to thousands of strangers. It is honestly so sad when bitter single women try to take on too much and just fail. Brittany continued, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive poison. "We had to step in and take over the property to save it from going into total ruin. It was a tough decision, but sometimes family has to do the hard things to fix someone else's huge mistakes. Plus, a grand estate like this really needs a strong man to manage the heavy lifting." I stopped the screen recording and safely backed up the video file to my secure cloud server. Brittany had just handed me a golden piece of evidence. She had publicly broadcasted her illegal occupation of my property, openly admitted to planning unpermitted demolitions on a historically protected interior, and explicitly defamed my financial standing to hundreds of thousands of people. In the legal world, we call this a highly lucrative defamation and property damage slam dunk. Just as I was cataloging the video file, my phone vibrated aggressively across the desk. It was a barrage of text messages from the family group chat. I opened the application and saw a long block of text from my father, Richard. He was clearly feeling incredibly bold and victorious after successfully kicking me out of the house the night before. His message was a masterclass in toxic gaslighting and patriarchal manipulation. "Learn to accept reality, Natalie," he wrote. "You are a single woman who works entirely too much. You have dedicated your whole life to chasing corporate promotions, and look where it got you. You are completely alone. Women with advanced degrees always end up alone because they forget how to be proper family members. You should be down on your knees thanking us. You should be happy your sister has a real man like Jamal to take care of this massive estate because you clearly could not handle the pressure." Before I could process the sheer audacity of his text, Brenda chimed in with her own message. "Your father is completely right, sweetheart," she typed, adding a praying hands emoji. "We know you are probably feeling very jealous of your sister right now, but holding on to that bitter resentment is just toxic. Let the men handle the business and the assets. You should focus on finding a husband before your biological clock runs out completely. We are doing you a massive favor by lifting this heavy real estate burden off your shoulders." I sat in my hotel chair staring at the glowing screen. Their absolute delusion was almost fascinating to witness. They truly believed that because I was an unmarried woman without children, I was completely incapable of managing a valuable asset. They thought my law degree was just a cute little hobby, and that Jamal, a man drowning in secret financial debt, was somehow my superior simply because he was a man. I placed my fingers on the keyboard, knowing exactly how to play this psychological game. If I argued with them, they would just call me hysterical and defensive. If I threatened them, they might get spooked and try to cover their tracks before the federal crime was fully executed. I needed to feed their massive egos to keep them comfortable in their stolen castle. "I understand, Dad," I typed, keeping my response short and submissive. "I am just feeling very overwhelmed right now. I need some time alone to process everything that happened." Richard replied very quickly, "That is a good girl. Take days to calm your emotions. We will talk about letting you pick up the rest of your cheap clothes next week." I locked my screen. They were the prey now. I set my phone down and turned my full attention back to the high-definition surveillance feed on my laptop screen. The morning sunlight was streaming through the large bay windows of the parlor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Jamal and Brittany had temporarily left the room, leaving my stepmother Brenda alone with my grandmother Clara's most prized possessions. Brenda was pacing back and forth across the authentic 19th century Persian rug, holding her cell phone tightly to her ear. I reached out and turned up the volume on my computer speakers, isolating the audio feed from the hidden camera disguised as a smoke detector directly above her head. Brenda sounded incredibly eager and highly secretive. "Yes, I need someone to come out here immediately," Brenda was saying into the phone, her voice a harsh whisper. "We just took possession of this massive estate in Beacon Hill, and it is completely full of outdated junk. We are doing a full modern renovation, and I need all of this old antique furniture cleared out today. I am talking about solid mahogany dining sets, original oil paintings, and a massive grandfather clock. I will take cash right now if you can bring a truck before noon." My blood ran ice cold as I listened to her casually trying to pawn off generations of my family history for quick spending money. My grandmother Clara had spent her entire life meticulously curating that collection. The grandfather clock alone was a rare antique imported from Europe over a century ago, worth more than Brenda had ever earned in her entire life. The oil paintings hanging on the walls were original pieces by renowned local artists. They were not just valuable assets, they were irreplaceable family heirlooms, holding deep emotional significance. Brenda was treating them like garbage from a yard sale, simply because she wanted some fast cash to fund her shopping habits. I watched her walk over to a solid silver tea set resting on the credenza, picking up a heavy teapot and examining the hallmark on the bottom. She smiled greedily, clearly calculating how many designer handbags she could buy with the melted-down silver. I heard the dealer on the other end of the phone agree to send an appraisal team to the brownstone at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Brenda hung up the phone doing a ridiculous little victory dance in the middle of my parlor. I had to stop that sale immediately. But my legal mind quickly calculated the massive risks of interfering directly. If I drove over there right now and physically blocked the antique dealers from taking the furniture, I would blow my cover entirely. Richard and Brenda would instantly realize I was actively monitoring the property. They might panic and destroy the forged quitclaim deed before I could officially pin the federal charges on them. If I called the police to report a theft, the authorities would just look at Richard's forged deed and declare it a civil dispute over inheritance. I could not risk showing my hand too early. I needed a distraction. I needed to stall Brenda just long enough to let the federal financial crimes fully materialize. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my elite network of professional contacts. I stopped on the name Harrison. Harrison was a junior partner at my law firm, known for his ruthless negotiation skills and his incredible ability to think on his feet. I called Harrison, and he answered on the second ring. I quickly explained the entire situation, giving him the exact address of the brownstone and a detailed description of the specific antique pieces Brenda was trying to liquidate. I need you to play a role, I told him, keeping my voice steady and commanding. I need you to pose as an exclusive high-end art dealer and private collector from Manhattan. You represent anonymous billionaire buyers who specialize in 19th century Boston antiquities. You need to contact Brenda before the local pawn shop guys show up, and you need to appeal directly to her bottomless greed. Harrison chuckled softly, understanding the assignment perfectly. Consider it done, Natalie, he said. I will make her an offer she is far too greedy to refuse. We hung up, and I immediately went back to monitoring the live audio and video feeds from the parlor. I watched Brenda instructing the movers to start hauling the heavy mahogany chairs toward the front door to prepare for the local dealer arrival. She was barking orders like a tyrant, completely oblivious to the trap I was currently setting. 10 minutes later, Brenda's cell phone rang. I watched her glance at the caller identification, looking confused by the out-of-state New York number before answering. "Hello?" Brenda asked. Over the hidden camera audio feed, I could hear Harrison's smooth, professional, and incredibly persuasive voice. "Good morning," he said, adopting a perfectly arrogant tone. "Am I speaking with the new owner of the Beacon Hill estate?" I was informed by a confidential source in the local historical society that you might be liquidating some significant 19th century assets. Brenda's posture instantly changed. She stood up straighter, suddenly trying to sound sophisticated and wealthy. "Yes, I am the lady of the house," she replied, putting on a fake transatlantic accent. "Who exactly is calling?" Harrison introduced himself as a premier acquisitions director for a private syndicate of global billionaires. He told Brenda that his clients were highly interested in the specific grandfather clock and the original oil paintings currently residing in her parlor. He casually mentioned that local dealers would completely rip her off, offering mere pennies on the dollar for items that his elite clients would gladly pay absolute top-tier premium market value for. Brenda's eyes widened with sheer greed. She immediately canceled the local pickup, securing the priceless heirlooms and buying me the precious time I needed to lock my federal trap today. I watched Brenda cancel the local pickup through my laptop screen, knowing her greed had just bought me the exact time I needed. I leaned back and took a deep breath. But before I could even process my small victory, my cell phone vibrated violently against the desk. The caller identification displayed a name that made my blood boil. It was Jamal. Jamal was calling me just hours after throwing me out of my own home. He wanted to gloat and rub his supposed victory right in my face. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I quickly opened a secure recording application on my phone. As a lawyer dealing with high-stakes fraud, I always maintain the tools necessary to document criminal admissions. I pressed the red record button and then swiped to accept the call, putting him on speakerphone. "Hello?" I answered, keeping my voice deliberately soft and unsteady, as if I had been crying all morning. Jamal let out a very loud, arrogant laugh. "Well, if it is not the former lady of the house," he said, his tone dripping with intense condescension. "I just wanted to call and make sure you found a nice little apartment to rent. Something small, where you can stack your boring legal paperwork." I gritted my teeth, my fingers clenching into fists, but I maintained my submissive act. "I am at a hotel," I murmured, sounding entirely defeated. "It is very overwhelming, Jamal. I just do not understand how this happened so fast." That is exactly the opening he was looking for. Jamal loves nothing more than hearing himself talk, especially when he thinks he is sounding like a brilliant entrepreneur. "Listen closely, Natalie, because I will explain how the real world operates," he said, adopting the tone of a teacher. He then proceeded to completely mansplain basic property law to a senior partner in real estate litigation. It took every ounce of my professional control not to laugh at his ignorance. When property transfers happen within a family, it is about whoever takes physical initiative. Jamal continued spouting legal nonsense. Your father and I recognize that this historic brownstone was completely wasted on a single woman. An asset of this magnitude requires aggressive capitalization. My new tech startup needs a premium headquarters to secure our next round of venture capital funding. The parlor we are gutting today is going to be our main executive pitching room. I forced a pathetic-sounding sniffle into the phone receiver. But the house means so much to me, I whispered. Grandma Clara wanted me to have it. I just do not understand how the legal system could let you take it from me with that single piece of paper. Jamal scoffed loudly, his ego inflating with every word. Law is written by the winners, Nat, he said, quoting the exact arrogant phrase I knew he would use. You are just a low-level paper pusher. Let the real businessmen handle the assets. We understand how to leverage real estate to build a corporate empire. You just sit at a desk and review zoning permits all day. I bit my tongue incredibly hard. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to feel so invincible and unchallenged that he would freely admit to the criminal methods they used to acquire the property. But Jamal, I asked, pitching my voice an octave higher to sound incredibly naive and confused. I looked at that quitclaim deed before I left. I simply noticed the notary stamp had an expired date on it, and Grandma's signature looked a little bit different. Does the bank not check those kinds of things when you file the paperwork? Jamal laughed again, completely falling right into my carefully laid trap. Oh, Natalie, you are so incredibly naive about how high-level finance works, he boasted. Banks do not look at minor clerical errors when you bring them a property worth over $2 million. Your father and I simply found a standard template online. We printed it out and handled the signatures ourselves to speed up the process. Your grandmother was already gone, so we just took care of the administrative bottleneck. We expedited the transfer because time is money in the startup world. Nobody is going to scrutinize an expired stamp when the head of the family is the one presenting the paperwork. My heart hammered in my chest, but my face remained an absolute mask of cold calculation. He had just openly admitted to forging a legal document on a recorded line. He had explicitly confirmed that he and my father bypassed legal authentication to manufacture a fake deed. But I needed one more piece of the puzzle to secure a federal conviction. I needed to know exactly what they were doing with that forged deed right now. I am so scared, Jamal, I cried, forcing my voice to tremble. What if you mess up the house and lose value? Grandma worked hard to pay off that property. It is completely paid off, right, Jamal? Let out a dismissive snort. Not anymore, he bragged proudly. That is the beauty of business. Leverage, Natalie. Your father and I took that deed straight to the bank this morning. We are pulling massive equity out of the property to fund my startup and cover your sister's lifestyle expenses. We turn brick into capital. You could never understand that kind of financial strategy. I had everything I needed to destroy them all entirely. He had confessed to the ridiculous forgery without any hesitation. He had confessed to using that fake forgery to extract huge amounts of capital from a federally insured bank. I let out one final pathetic sigh to seal the performance. I guess you are right, Jamal, I whispered, sounding completely broken and defeated by his overwhelming intelligence. I just do not understand complex business like you do. I will leave you alone to build your magnificent tech empire. I disconnected the call right before he could say another arrogant word. I immediately stopped the recording and securely backed up the pristine audio file directly to my highly encrypted professional legal server. I sat back in my hotel chair, staring at the surveillance screen with a slow, dangerous smile spreading widely across my face. Jamal thought he was a brilliant, unstoppable winner, writing the laws of the modern world. He had absolutely no idea he had just officially handed a senior litigation partner a fully wrapped gift of undeniable and highly illegal federal crimes. This was exactly what I wanted all along today. I minimized the recording application on my phone and immediately opened my encrypted email portal. Jamal arrogant confession confirmed. They were extracting equity from the property, but I needed the full financial picture before I brought the hammer down. People do not usually commit blatant federal bank fraud unless they are backed into a terrifying financial corner. I needed to know exactly what kind of corner my father and brother-in-law were currently trapped in. I composed an urgent message to Oliver, the lead forensic accountant at my law firm. Oliver is a financial bloodhound who can trace hidden assets and shell companies across the globe in a matter of hours. I attached the audio file of Jamal confessing, along with the basic details of his supposed tech startup. I gave Oliver a specific directive. I told him to dig into every single bank account, corporate filing, and tax return associated with Richard and Jamal. I needed to know why they were so incredibly desperate to steal my property this exact weekend. While I waited for Oliver and his team to follow the money trail, I turned my attention back to the live surveillance feeds running on my laptop screen. The scene unfolding inside my historic brownstone made my stomach turn with pure anger. My grandmother Clara had spent her entire life filling that home with elegance and grace, and my stepfamily was treating it like a cheap demolition site. On the parlor camera, I watched Jamal pacing back and forth with a large sledgehammer in his hands. He was actively destroying the original 19th century wainscoting that lined the bottom half of the walls. With every swing of the hammer, he splintered the beautiful dark wood, leaving jagged holes in the historic plaster behind it. Brittany was standing a few feet away, recording the destruction on her phone. She was jumping up and down, cheering him on as he obliterated a piece of Boston architectural history. She kept shouting to her followers about how they were creating an open-concept modern vibe for her new lifestyle brand. The destruction did not stop in the parlor. I switched the feed to the main hallway and saw my stepmother Brenda dragging heavy garbage bags across the original hardwood floors. The metal zippers on the bags left deep scratching gouges in the polished wood with every step she took. She was casually throwing away my grandmother collection of vintage silk curtains and hand-embroidered linens. My father Richard was directing a pair of hired handymen to rip down the custom brass chandelier that hung above the dining room table. He complained loudly about how ugly and old-fashioned the fixtures were. It took an incredible amount of willpower to remain seated in my hotel chair. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to drive back to Beacon Hill, kick the front door open, and physically remove them from my property. But I forced myself to watch the devastation silently. Every swing of Jamal hammer, every scratch on the floor, and every broken fixture was adding thousands of dollars in property damage to the civil lawsuit I was building against them. 2 hours later, my phone rang sharply. It was Oliver. He sounded breathless and agitated. "Natalie," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "I have been doing this job for 20 years, and I have never seen a financial cluster fire quite this massive. Your brother-in-law Jamal is not a tech entrepreneur. He is a walking Ponzi scheme." Oliver proceeded to break down the grim reality of Jamal's supposed tech empire. The startup was a complete sham. Jamal had taken out massive predatory loans from unregulated private lenders to fund his lavish lifestyle and keep up appearances on social media. His company had 0 viable products, 0 actual employees, and a negative balance sheet that was bleeding cash every single day. He owed nearly $400,000 to people who were actively threatening to collect. But that was only half of the disaster. Oliver then turned to my father's financial records. Richard had always projected the image of a wealthy, successful businessman, but his accounts told a different story. To keep his new wife Brenda happy, Richard had been funding her bottomless shopping addictions with high-interest credit cards for the past decade. He had completely drained his retirement accounts and was currently drowning in over $200,000 of unsecured debt. They were both entirely broke and desperate. "That is why they needed the house," I said out loud to the empty hotel room. Oliver confirmed my theory immediately. "Exactly, Natalie. They're totally desperate. They forged the deed to secure a massive home equity line of credit against your property. They plan to use that bank money to pay off the private lenders and clear their credit card debt before anyone realizes they are completely bankrupt." The pieces of the puzzle locked together perfectly. This was never just about a family feud or Richard asserting dominance over me. This was a calculated heist by two men drowning in their own financial incompetence. They saw my grandmother $2.5 million brownstone as a giant piggy bank to save them from ruin. They thought they could simply forge a single piece of paper, kick the quiet lawyer daughter out onto the street, and walk away incredibly wealthy. I thanked Oliver for his brilliant work and hung up the phone. The intense rage I felt earlier was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. I looked back at the bright laptop screen. Jamal was now standing in the middle of my ruined parlor, admiring the giant holes he had just smashed into the historic walls. He looked incredibly proud of himself, believing he had successfully secured the perfect headquarters for his fake company. He had absolutely no idea that federal agents would soon be tearing his entire life apart. I read through the application details, shaking my head at their stupidity. To secure this massive line of credit, they had submitted the forged quitclaim deed as their primary proof of ownership. They literally uploaded a fake legal document to a federally insured banking institution through an online portal. They assumed the bank would push the paperwork through quickly because the property was fully paid off and appraised at nearly $3 million. They figured the bank would see the massive equity and rubber stamp the $600,000 loan without digging too deeply into the recent property transfer. And unfortunately for the bank, they were right. The second document in Oliver's dossier was a wire transfer confirmation. The National Bank had already approved the preliminary draw. They had deposited the first tranche of funds directly into a brand new joint checking account that Jamal had set up just 2 days ago. I watched the live camera feed again. Jamal was standing in my ruined parlor, proudly swiping through his phone, likely looking at that exact bank balance. He thought he was a financial genius. He thought he had successfully hacked the system to save his failing startup and fund Brittany's lavish influencer lifestyle. He thought he had outsmarted the quiet lawyer's sister, who just let them take her house. A cold, sharp smile spread across my face as I leaned back in my hotel chair. What Jamal and Richard completely failed to understand was the massive, unbridgeable gap between local civil disputes and federal criminal offenses. If they had simply forged the quitclaim deed to live in the house, they would have committed a state-level crime. Forge and filing a false instrument with the county registry are serious offenses, but in Massachusetts, a first-time offender with a good defense lawyer might negotiate their way down to probation or a few months in a minimum security county facility. They would claim it was a family dispute over a vague inheritance, and the local courts might show them some leniency. But they did not stop at simply occupying the property. By uploading that forged deed to a national bank portal, they transmitted fraudulent documents across state lines using an electronic communication network. In the eyes of the law, that action instantly upgrades their little family theft into federal wire fraud. Furthermore, by using that fake document to intentionally deceive a federally insured financial institution into lending them $600,000, they committed federal bank fraud. These are not minor infractions that you can smooth over with a heartfelt apology and a good suit. Federal prosecutors do not care about family drama or inheritance disputes. They care about protecting the integrity of the national banking system. The federal statutes for these specific financial crimes are absolutely merciless. Bank fraud alone carries a maximum penalty of 30 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $1 million per violation. Wire fraud carries an additional 20 years. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They took a localized family betrayal and voluntarily escalated it into a federal case that would trigger mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. My father and my brother-in-law were no longer just greedy family members trying to steal my grandmother's legacy. They were now actively participating in a major felony conspiracy against the United States government. I looked at the wire transfer confirmation document again, tracing the routing numbers with my eyes. The money was already sitting in their joint account. The crime was fully completed and entirely documented. They had left a pristine, unalterable digital footprint that any federal prosecutor would consider an absolute slam dunk. I felt a deep, thrilling sense of satisfaction washing over me. All my life, Richard had treated me like a disappointment because I chose to study law instead of marrying a wealthy businessman like Brittany did. He constantly mocked my profession, claiming I was just pushing papers while real men built empires. He allowed my stepmother Brenda to openly disrespect my career, and he encouraged Jamal to talk down to me at every family gathering. Now his arrogance had handed me the ultimate weapon to destroy him. I did not even need to file a civil lawsuit to get my beautiful home back. I just needed to hand this immaculate financial dossier over to the proper federal authorities and let the United States Department of Justice do all the heavy lifting for me. The stakes had officially shifted from a simple eviction notice to decades behind bars. They were going to lose absolutely everything. They would lose their freedom, their fake status, and their entire future. I closed the encrypted file on my laptop, feeling completely empowered. The trap was fully loaded. Now I just needed to make sure the federal agents had the perfect audio evidence to secure a guaranteed conviction, and I knew exactly how to get that final piece. Today. Before making that crucial phone call, I needed to fully digest the rest of the financial bombshells Oliver had compiled. I opened the second encrypted folder on my laptop, which contained the deep dive into Jamal and my father's personal finances. As a lawyer, I am accustomed to reviewing corporate bankruptcies and messy divorces, but the sheer scale of financial ruin displayed on my screen was absolutely staggering. Jamal had always strutted around our family gatherings, acting like the next major tech visionary. He constantly bragged about seed funding rounds and angel investors. The reality hidden inside Oliver's forensic report was entirely different. Jamal Tech Startup did not exist in any functional capacity. There was no proprietary software, no patents, and absolutely no client roster. The business address listed on his corporate filings was just a cheap virtual mailbox in a strip mall. The financial statements showed that Jamal had completely fabricated his revenue projections to secure initial funding from a group of aggressive, unregulated private lenders. These were not standard venture capitalists. They were hard money lenders who operated in the shadows, charging predatory interest rates and demanding rapid repayment. According to the intercepted communication logs Oliver legally acquired through a skip tracing protocol, Jamal was currently $400,000 in the red. These lenders were not politely asking for their money back. The recent emails and text messages sent to Jamal business accounts were explicit and highly threatening. They were promising to seize his personal assets and initiate aggressive collection tactics. Jamal was a desperate man, backed into a very dangerous corner. He needed massive amounts of cash immediately to save himself from total ruin. But Jamal could not pull off this grand real estate heist alone. He needed my father to provide the ultimate family cover story. I opened the next set of documents detailing Richard's financial history. For my entire life, my father had maintained the arrogant facade of a highly successful, elite Boston businessman. He loved to lecture me about fiscal responsibility and the importance of building a secure legacy. The truth staring back at me from the bank records proved he was an absolute hypocrite. Richard was completely broke. His financial downfall was directly tied to my stepmother, Brenda. Over the last decade, Brenda had developed an insatiable luxury shopping addiction. The credit card statements showed hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on designer clothes, high-end vehicles, and luxury vacations, just so she could maintain a fake socialite status among her wealthy friends. To fund Brenda bottomless greed, Richard had systematically drained his entire retirement portfolio. When the liquid cash ran out, he started maxing out high-yield personal loans. The bank records showed that he was currently drowning in over $200,000 of unsecured debt. He was just weeks away from facing total bankruptcy. My father and my brother-in-law were two desperate, drowning men who saw my grandmother's historic $2.5 million Beacon Hill brownstone as their only life raft. But the most sickening part of their scheme was not just the theft. It was the malicious, calculating way they planned to leave me holding the bag. I reviewed the terms of the home equity line of credit they had just fraudulently acquired from the National Bank using that forged quitclaim deed. The mechanics of their crime were brutally clear. By forging my grandmother's signature, they transferred the property into Richard's name. They then used the house as collateral to pull out the $600,000 in pure, unadulterated cash. The wire transfer showed they planned to use $400,000 to pay off Jamal's dangerous private lenders and $200,000 to wipe out Richard and Brenda mounting credit card debt. They would completely clear their own ledgers and save their fake wealthy lifestyles. But they had absolutely no intention of ever making a single monthly payment on that massive bank loan. I sat in my quiet hotel room piecing together their endgame. Since the loan was secured by the physical property, the bank would eventually demand repayment. When Richard and Jamal inevitably defaulted on the monthly installments, the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings to recoup their $600,000. The bank would seize the historic brownstone and auction it off to the highest bidder. My grandmother's beloved estate would be sold off to strangers, and I would be left completely homeless and permanently disinherited. Furthermore, because they would eventually argue that the original property transfer was legitimate, they planned to leave the foreclosure stain entirely on the property record, essentially wiping out my entire inheritance while walking away with clean hands and full bank accounts. They did not just want to steal from me. They wanted to financially annihilate me while saving themselves. My father, the man who was supposed to protect me, was perfectly willing to let me lose everything my grandmother worked for, just so his new wife could keep buying designer handbags. My brother-in-law was willing to commit federal bank fraud and destroy my future just to cover up his pathetic failure of a tech startup. They thought I was just a naive paper pusher who would quietly accept defeat and walk away crying. They thought their combined male arrogance was enough to outsmart a senior partner in real estate litigation. I closed the financial dossiers, feeling a deep, freezing anger settle into my bones. The time for gathering evidence was officially over. I had their motive, their methods, and the undeniable proof of their completed federal wire fraud. Now I needed to deliver the final, lethal blow. I picked up my cell phone and prepared to make the call that would seal their fate forever. I needed Richard to verbally confirm his malicious intent on a recorded line so the federal prosecutors would have absolutely no hesitation when issuing the arrest warrants. I dialed my father's number, ready to play my ultimate role. I stared at my phone screen and canceled the call to my father. If I called Richard right now, without having federal authorities fully briefed, he might panic. He could attempt to transfer the funds offshore or destroy physical evidence. I needed the federal machinery locked and loaded before engaging him directly. During my time at Harvard Law School, I belonged to a fiercely competitive study group. One of my closest study partners took a different path. David was now a decorated special agent in the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, stationed right here in the Boston field office. We had maintained a solid professional relationship over the years. I dialed David's private direct line. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp. "Natalie," he said, sounding genuinely pleased. To what do I owe the pleasure of a call on a Saturday afternoon? I did not waste time with pleasantries. David, I need to officially report a massive federal bank fraud and wire fraud conspiracy in progress, I said, my voice deadpan. The perpetrators are currently physically occupying the target property, and the fraudulently obtained funds just hit their accounts a few hours ago. The entire crime is documented and ready for immediate federal prosecution. David's tone shifted instantly to strictly business. I am listening, he said. Walk me through the exact mechanics of the heist. I spent 20 minutes giving David a high-level legal briefing. I explained how my grandmother Clara had passed away, and how my father Richard and my brother Jamal had fabricated a quitclaim deed to steal her Beacon Hill brownstone. I detailed the sloppy nature of the forgery, pointing out the expired notary stamp and mismatched signature. But David, I continued emphasizing the most critical legal element. They did not just break state laws by trespassing and forging a local property deed. They took that forged document and uploaded it to the National Bank portal. They used a fake deed to secure a $600,000 home equity line of credit. The bank approved the draw and wired the funds across state lines this morning. I heard David typing rapidly on his secure terminal. Sending fraudulent documents across state lines to deceive a federally insured bank is a textbook violation of federal wire fraud and bank fraud statutes, David stated, confirming my analysis. Do you have the digital paper trail to back this up? I smiled grimly. I have absolutely everything, I replied. I am sending a heavily encrypted file to your secure federal portal right now. I hit send on my laptop, transferring the massive dossier that Oliver had compiled. David opened the file on his end. I walked him through every single piece of evidence. I showed him the forged quitclaim deed, highlighting the glaring administrative errors. I directed his attention to the bank loan application, which clearly showed Richard and Jamal signing as co-borrowers. Then I pointed out the most damning piece of digital evidence Oliver had extracted. We have the exact IP addresses used to submit the fraudulent loan application, I told David. The IP addresses perfectly match the residential Wi-Fi network at Richard's suburban house. They filed the fake paperwork from his home office before driving over to my brownstone to stage their hostile takeover. There is absolutely no way they can claim their identities were stolen. The digital footprint leads directly back to Richard's personal router. David let out a low whistle of disbelief. These guys are incredibly reckless, he muttered, reviewing the documents. They handed us a perfectly wrapped federal indictment. But wait, there is more, I added. I need you to look at the corporate documents Jamal filed for his alleged tech startup. I explained how Jamal was $400,000 in debt to private lenders. I showed David the threatening emails and text messages Jamal had received, demanding immediate repayment. I then laid out the financial ruins of Richard's personal accounts, showing the massive credit card debt he had accumulated funding his wife Brenda's luxury shopping habits. They pulled the $600,000 equity line to save themselves from total bankruptcy, I concluded. They planned to wipe out their personal debts using my grandmother's house as collateral and then intentionally default on the loan, leaving the bank to foreclose on my property. They are attempting to financially annihilate me while walking away completely debt-free. David was silent for a long moment, absorbing the sheer scale of their greed. Natalie, this is one of the most documented fraud cases I have ever seen, he finally said. You have handed us the motive, the method, and the digital execution of a major federal crime. The bank records and the IP addresses alone are enough to secure grand jury indictments for both of them. We can freeze that newly opened joint checking account immediately before they have a chance to wire the stolen funds to their private creditors. That is exactly what I want, I replied. I want their assets frozen, and I want them arrested inside my house. I want them to face the maximum federal consequences. David agreed completely, but his investigator instincts kicked in. We have the paper trail locked down tightly, Natalie, he said. The digital evidence is immaculate. However, to make this an airtight conviction that will guarantee maximum sentencing without a plea deal, I need one more thing. I need verbal confirmation of their criminal intent. I need them to explicitly admit they took money out of the house and intend to keep it. If you get Richard to confirm the financial extraction on a recorded line, we can move straight to issuing the arrest warrants today. I looked at the phone in my hand. I knew how to extract that verbal confession. I will get that recording right now, I promised David. Keep your team ready. The trap was set, and it was time to close the steel jaws. I disconnected the call with David and immediately opened the secure audio recording application on my phone. The trap was fully set, and it was time to close the steel jaws. I took a few seconds to mentally prepare for the performance of a lifetime. I needed to sound completely broken, utterly defeated, and desperate for any scrap of paternal affection. I cleared my throat, forcing my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I squeezed my eyes shut tight until a few real tears pricked the corners, giving my voice that authentic, thick quality of someone who had been sobbing for hours. When I felt fully immersed in the role of the discarded, pathetic daughter, I pressed the red record button and dialed my father's cell phone number. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. The background noise on his end was loud. I could hear the sounds of heavy furniture being dragged across the hardwood floors, and Jamal shouting orders to a delivery crew. My stomach twisted at the audio confirmation of them destroying my grandmother's beautiful home. But I pushed the anger down deep. I needed to be entirely focused on extracting the confession. "Hello," Richard barked into the receiver, sounding annoyed by the interruption. His tone was sharp and impatient, the voice of a very busy and important man who did not have time for nonsense. "Dad?" I whispered, letting my voice tremble violently. "Please do not hang up. I just need to talk to you for a minute." He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "Natalie, I told you to give us space. We are incredibly busy here today. Jamal and I are coordinating a massive property upgrade, and Brenda is trying to clear out all the old junk your grandmother hoarded. What do you possibly want now?" I forced a loud, pathetic sob into the microphone, holding the phone slightly away from my mouth so it sounded authentic. "I am at a hotel downtown, Dad," I cried, my voice cracking perfectly. "The front desk just told me my credit card was declined for the security deposit. I do not have anywhere to go. I cannot afford to stay here, and I cannot afford a new apartment lease right now. I am completely broke and terrified." "Well, that sounds like a personal financial failure," Richard replied, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You are a 33-year-old woman, Natalie. You should have planned your finances better, instead of wasting your money on expensive law school degrees that clearly do not pay well. You should have found a husband to provide for you, like Brittany did. I cannot fix your poor life choices." I know, I sobbed, leaning into the pathetic persona. "You were right about everything, Dad. You and Jamal are the real businessmen. I do not understand how any of this property stuff works. I just need a tiny bit of help to get back on my feet so I will not be homeless." I heard him chuckle softly on the other end of the line. The sound of his inflated ego expanding was practically audible. "You are finally admitting that you need the head of the family to save you," he said, sounding incredibly smug. "That is a first, but unfortunately, my money is tied up in important investments right now." That was the exact opening I needed. I took a shaky breath and delivered the bait perfectly. "But what about the house, Dad?" I pleaded, sounding entirely innocent and naive. "Grandma Clara house is completely paid off. It is worth over $2 million. If you and Jamal took ownership of the deed, could you maybe just take a tiny loan out against the property? I only need $10,000 for a basic apartment deposit and some cheap furniture." $10,000 is nothing compared to the massive equity in that house. "Please, Dad, just $10,000 out of the house equity." Richard let out a cruel, booming laugh. It was a laugh completely devoid of any paternal warmth or human empathy. It was the laugh of a greedy, desperate criminal who thought he had just executed the perfect heist against a naive victim. Take a tiny loan out against the property, he mocked, repeating my words back to me with pure derision. Oh, Natalie, you really are completely clueless about how high-level corporate finance operates. You think small. You think like a low-level paper pusher. We do not do tiny loans in this family anymore. What do you mean? I asked, pitching my voice an octave higher to sound incredibly confused. I mean, you are way too late to ask for a cut of the pie, Richard bragged, his ego completely overriding any basic sense of self-preservation. Jamal and I already pulled $600,000 out of that brick pile this morning. We took the deed straight to the National Bank and secured a massive commercial line of credit. The wire transfer already cleared into our private accounts. We extracted the maximum liquid capital to fund real business ventures. I held my breath, ensuring the recording software was capturing every single syllable of his confession. But Dad, I cried softly, if you pulled out $600,000, surely you can spare just $10,000 for your own daughter, so I am not out on the street? It is grandmother money. It was her money, Richard corrected sharply. Now it is our money. Jamal and I executed the aggressive financial strategy to secure those funds. We took the initiative to expedite the property transfer and lock down the banking capital. We did the heavy lifting. You get absolutely nothing, Natalie, not a single cent. You lost your chance at this inheritance the day you decided to disrespect my authority and choose a pathetic legal career over finding a wealthy husband. But how will I survive? I whimpered, pushing him for one final confirmation of his malicious intent. You are leaving me with absolutely nothing. That is exactly right, Richard stated, his voice completely devoid of any remorse. You get nothing. It is our money now. Jamal needs the capital to expand his tech empire, and Brenda needs to upgrade her wardrobe for our new Beacon Hill lifestyle. You can figure out your own housing situation. Learn to be a real woman, and maybe a man will rescue you. Do not call me again until you are ready to apologize for your historic disrespect. The line went dead. He hung up on me. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and stopped the recording. The fake tears on my face had already dried. I sat in the absolute silence of my hotel room, staring at the saved audio file on my screen. My heart was pounding with a fierce, relentless rhythm of pure victory. I had done it. I had extracted the exact verbal confirmation the federal agents needed. Richard had just explicitly admitted to pulling $600,000 from a federally insured bank using the property as collateral. He had explicitly confirmed his intent to keep the stolen funds for personal enrichment. He had explicitly confirmed the conspiracy with Jamal. I immediately opened my encrypted email portal and attached the pristine audio file. I typed a quick message to Special Agent David. Subject line, smoking gun secured. Audio confirmation of federal wire fraud and bank fraud attached. Motive and execution explicitly confessed on a recorded line. I hit send and watched the progress bar complete the transfer. My phone rang less than 60 seconds later. It was David. I just listened to the audio file, David said, his voice vibrating with professional intensity. Natalie, this is absolute perfection. He confessed to the exact dollar amount, the extraction method, and the intent to deprive the rightful owner. He handed us the entire federal case on a silver platter. My team is moving to secure the federal arrest warrants from the magistrate judge right now. We are also initiating an immediate hard freeze on their joint checking account. They will not be able to move a single penny of those stolen funds. Thank you, David, I replied, feeling a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. Let me know when the warrants are signed. I have a very specific plan for how I want the arrests to go down. I want maximum visibility. David chuckled, acknowledging my strategic thinking. Just give the word, counselor, and we will bring the cavalry. We ended the call, and I closed my laptop. The legal trap was completely locked and loaded. Now I just needed the perfect stage to execute the final devastating blow. I needed Richard and Jamal to gather an audience. I needed them to feel like absolute kings before I stripped them of everything they valued. And knowing their insatiable need for social validation, I knew exactly what they were going to do next. They were going to throw a party. I walked over to my hotel window and looked out at the Boston skyline. The storm was coming for them, and they had absolutely no idea. Inside that metal box sat the absolute masterpiece of my grandmother's legal foresight. I reached past my emergency passports to pull out a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. I broke the seal and slid the pristine, heavy parchment documents onto the polished viewing table. These were not just standard last will and testament papers. They were certified, stamped, and fully notarized original copies of the Clara Historical Preservation Trust. My grandmother was an incredibly shrewd woman. She knew exactly what my father Richard was capable of. She had watched him drain his own assets to fund Brenda's luxury shopping addictions and continuously mistreat me in favor of Brittany. 5 years before she passed away, Clara came to my law firm. She sat in my office and told me she wanted to protect her brownstone from Richard's greedy hands. We had executed a brilliant, unbreakable legal maneuver. We placed the massive multi-million-dollar property into an irrevocable trust. This is a specific type of legal vehicle that operates like a financial fortress. Once an asset is placed inside an irrevocable trust, it ceases to belong to the individual who created it. The trust itself becomes a completely separate legal entity that owns the property. Clara essentially removed her own name from the deed 5 years ago. She named me as the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. This legal reality made Richard and Jamal's forged quitclaim deed not just a criminal forgery, but an absolute legal impossibility. Even if my grandmother had signed their pathetic document right before she died, the signature would have been completely meaningless. A person cannot quitclaim a property they do not own. I ran my fingers over the raised notary seal on the trust documents, feeling a deep surge of gratitude for my grandmother's protective love. Richard and Jamal had built their entire criminal scheme on a massive foundation of profound ignorance. They assumed the property was still in Clara's personal name because they never bothered to conduct a proper title search. The national bank that approved their loan had also committed a catastrophic underwriting failure. Because the loan was processed through an expedited online portal, the banking software simply flagged the forged deed without cross-referencing the deeper historical trust filings. When the bank executives finally realized they wired federal funds based on a forged deed for a property locked inside an irrevocable trust, heads were going to roll. I carefully placed the certified trust documents into my leather briefcase. These papers were the absolute master key. They proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the only person on Earth with the legal authority to manage, occupy, or leverage the Beacon Hill brownstone. The documents proved that every single action my stepfamily had taken since breaking into my house was a highly documented felony. I locked the empty safe deposit box, returned it to the vault, and walked back out into the bright Boston sunlight. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Special Agent David. He confirmed the federal magistrate judge had officially signed the arrest warrants for Richard and Jamal, based on the wire fraud and bank fraud evidence we provided. The joint account holding the stolen funds was now completely frozen. David told me his tactical team was ready to execute the warrants whenever I gave the signal. I thanked him and told him to keep his agents on standby. I had been monitoring the hidden cameras in my house all morning. Jamal and Brittany had sent out hundreds of digital invitations the previous night. They were throwing a massive housewarming and startup launch party tonight to celebrate their newly stolen wealth. They invited high-profile investors, local Boston socialites, and dozens of Brittany's obnoxious influencer friends. They wanted a massive audience to witness their glorious ascension into high society. I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. I would let them gather all their wealthy friends, their potential investors, and their followers into one room. I would let them toast to their crimes. I drove back to my hotel suite and laid the certified trust documents out on the desk alongside my senior partner badge. I spent the afternoon meticulously preparing my final strategy. I reviewed the federal penal codes, ensuring I had every single statute memorized perfectly. I wanted to look Richard and Jamal in the eyes and recite the exact laws they broke right before the federal agents slapped the handcuffs on their wrists. I wanted Brenda to understand that her insatiable greed had just cost her husband his freedom. I wanted Brittany to realize that her fake influencer lifestyle was funded by federal bank fraud. The anticipation was electric. Tonight, the fake empire they built on the ashes of my grandmother's legacy would collapse. I poured a final cup of coffee and watched the winter evening sky darken over the Boston skyline. The trap was fully set. I was completely ready to take back my home and send my toxic family straight to federal prison for the rest of their greedy lives. The sun set over the Boston skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the city. I remained in my hotel suite, watching the live surveillance feeds on my laptop screen. The activity inside my Beacon Hill brownstone was ramping up to a fever pitch. Richard and Jamal were wasting absolutely no time burning through their stolen federal funds. They had hired an elite catering company to transform my grandmother Clara historic property into an overpriced nightclub. A team of workers in crisp white uniforms scurried through my foyer, carrying massive silver trays of caviar and expensive champagne flutes. They set up a fully stocked premium bar right in front of the damaged parlor wall, where Jamal had taken a sledgehammer to the original mahogany wainscoting just hours prior. I zoomed in on the high-definition feed from the dining room camera. Brenda was directing the floral arrangements. She had ordered thousands of dollars worth of rare white orchids, stuffing them into every available corner of the room. She was wearing a completely new designer gown, the tags probably still attached, clearly purchased with the fraudulently acquired equity from my house. She strutted around, barking orders at the catering staff, acting like she was a Boston aristocrat who had owned the estate for decades, instead of a desperate woman drowning in consumer debt who had just broken into the property the previous day. By 7 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. The doorbell rang continuously, and the sheer audacity of their guest list made my jaw tighten. Jamal had actually managed to invite several high-profile venture capitalists and angel investors from the local tech scene. He stood by the front door, wearing a custom-tailored suit, greeting these wealthy businessmen with firm handshakes and arrogant smiles. He was treating my home as the ultimate prop to validate his completely fake software startup. I turned up the audio feed and listened as Jamal pitched his non-existent company to a group of older investors. He confidently pointed to the high vaulted ceilings and original architectural details, claiming that he had recently purchased the estate to serve as the new global headquarters for his expanding enterprise. He lied with such effortless precision that it was truly terrifying to witness. My father Richard was working the other side of the room. He had invited his own network of business associates and country club acquaintances. These were the exact people he desperately needed to impress to hide the fact that he was completely bankrupt. I watched him clinking crystal glasses with a prominent Boston banker, laughing loudly and gesturing to the antique art on the walls. He was using my grandmother's legacy to project an illusion of extreme wealth and stability. He casually lied to his guests, explaining that he had inherited the grand estate and was doing extensive renovations to bring it up to his high standards. Every word out of his mouth was a calculated deception designed to feed his fragile ego and maintain his fraudulent social status. Meanwhile, my half-sister Brittany was putting on a sickening performance in the historic library. The room was packed with her fellow social media influencers, a group of loud, incredibly vain people holding professional lighting rings and camera stabilizers. Brittany had set up a designated content creation zone right next to my grandmother's vintage reading chair. She was live streaming the entire party to her massive audience, shouting over the loud music about how she and Jamal had manifested this incredible property through positive energy and relentless hard work. She posed for photos holding a glass of vintage champagne, tossing her hair, and bragging about the expensive catering. It was an absolute circus of vanity and theft. I sat perfectly still in my hotel chair, taking meticulous notes on everything I saw and heard. The caterers alone must have cost at least $30,000. The floral arrangements, the premium alcohol, the rented sound system, it was all being paid for by the $600,000 federal bank loan they had fraudulently secured that very morning. They were literally partying on stolen money inside a stolen house, completely oblivious to the massive federal investigation currently looming directly over their heads. They felt totally invincible. As the evening progressed, the music grew louder and the guests became more intoxicated. Jamal gathered a group of wealthy investors in the center of the devastated parlor. I listened through the hidden microphone as he pitched them a totally fabricated investment opportunity. He claimed his startup was on the verge of a major public offering, and he was offering them exclusive early access to equity shares. He used the brownstone as visual proof of his success, telling them that a man who could afford a $2.5 million estate in cash was a man they could trust with their money. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme playing out live on my computer screen. He was actively trying to defraud these investors while standing inside a house he had just defrauded a national bank to acquire. I checked my phone and saw a secure message from Special Agent David. His tactical team was fully briefed and positioned in an unmarked surveillance van just 2 blocks away from the brownstone. They were monitoring the exterior of the property and waiting for my signal. I replied with a quick confirmation, telling him to hold his position. I did not want to shut the party down just yet. I wanted Richard and Jamal to get as comfortable as possible. I wanted them to feel the absolute peak of their fake success before I ripped the rug entirely out from under them. I watched Brenda gather a group of wealthy wives in the kitchen. She was showing off my grandmother antique silver tea set, claiming it was a rare piece she had personally acquired at an exclusive auction in Europe. She poured them expensive wine and laughed about how hard it was to find good domestic help to clean such a massive house. Her absolute lack of shame was fascinating. She was living a total fantasy, completely disconnected from the reality of her crushing credit card debt and the impending federal indictments. The party was in full swing now, a massive, chaotic celebration of greed and illusion. I closed my laptop carefully, placing it into my leather briefcase alongside the certified irrevocable trust documents and my senior partner badge. I stood up and smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored suit. It was time to leave the hotel. It was time to crash the party. I walked out of the suite, ready to deliver a reality check that would echo through our family history forever. The interior of the van was completely dark, except for the glow of multiple high-definition monitors lining the walls. David was sitting in a swivel chair, wearing a tactical vest over his dress shirt. 2 other federal agents were stationed at the communication consoles, wearing headphones and monitoring the live audio feeds from my smart home system. David nodded at me, pointing to the main screen. "The party is escalating rapidly," he said. "They have over 70 guests inside your property right now. Jamal just pitched a fake seed funding round to a managing director from a major venture capital firm. We have the entire fraudulent solicitation recorded perfectly." I set my leather briefcase on a metal counter and took a seat next to David. I looked at the glowing monitors displaying every angle of my grandmother Clara's beautiful home. The level of disrespect occurring in real time was absolutely sickening to witness. Strangers were spilling red wine on the antique Persian rugs. Caterers were carelessly dragging heavy metal equipment across the original hardwood floors. The music was turned up so loud that the bass was visibly shaking the crystal chandelier in the dining room. But nothing prepared me for the sheer infuriating audacity of what my half-sister Brittany was about to do next in the historic reading room. I asked the agent at the console to enlarge the camera feed from that specific room. Brittany had invited at least a dozen of her social media influencer friends. They were completely taking over the space, treating my family heritage like a cheap rental studio. They had dragged expensive professional lighting stands and heavy camera tripods across the delicate wooden floors. Brittany was standing in the absolute center of the room, holding a glass of champagne. She was wearing a sequined party dress and instructing her friends on how to film a new viral dance trend for her internet channel. Right behind her, resting on a delicate mahogany side table, was my grandmother Clara's most prized possession. It was a stunning, breathtakingly rare antique stained glass artisan lamp. My grandfather had purchased it at an exclusive auction decades ago as an anniversary gift. It featured intricate pieces of colorful cut glass arranged in a beautiful floral pattern, and it was worth tens of thousands of dollars. More importantly, it held immense emotional value. I remember sitting under the warm glow of that specific lamp as a child while my grandmother read me stories about the history of Boston. It was a priceless family heirloom. I watched the screen intently as Brittany prepared to film her ridiculous dance video. She handed her champagne glass to one of her friends and positioned herself right in front of the mahogany side table. She shouted for her friends to start recording. Brittany began to perform an exaggerated, highly energetic dance routine, swinging her arms wildly and kicking her legs in the air. She was completely oblivious to her surroundings, prioritizing her fake internet fame over basic spatial awareness. She spun around sharply, throwing her right arm backward with maximum force. Her hand slammed directly into the fragile stained glass artisan lamp. The impact was violent. The heavy lamp tipped backward, sliding off the edge of the mahogany table. I gasped audibly inside the surveillance van, my hands gripping the edge of the metal counter. The microphone feed caught the devastating sound of the impact perfectly. The priceless heirloom hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 1,000 colorful pieces. The intricate stained glass exploded across the room, sending sharp shards flying in every direction. The beautiful antique bronze base snapped completely in half. A piece of my family history was destroyed in a single, careless second. The music in the reading room stopped. Brittany friends gasped, covering their mouths in shock as they looked down at the ruined masterpiece. I waited for my sister to show a single ounce of remorse. I waited for her to panic, to call for help, to realize the magnitude of what she had just destroyed. Instead, Brittany simply stared at the broken glass for a few seconds. Then she threw her head back and laughed. It was a loud, obnoxious laugh that echoed through the hidden microphone directly into my ears. "Oh well," Brittany giggled loudly, waving her hand dismissively at the ruined heirloom. "That old thing was totally hideous anyway. It completely ruined the modern aesthetic of my new studio. The room is actually much better without it." One of her influencer friends pointed nervously at the sharp pieces of colorful glass scattered across the floor. "Should we tell the caterers to bring a broom?" the friend asked. Brittany rolled her eyes, letting out an annoyed sigh. "Do not be ridiculous," she snapped. "I am not letting the cleaning staff interrupt my content creation schedule." What Brittany did next sent absolute, freezing rage straight through my veins. Wearing expensive designer heels, she casually began kicking large shards of broken glass directly under the edge of my grandmother antique rug. "Just step over it, guys," Brittany told her friends, laughing again. "Jamal can hire cheap laborers to clean it up tomorrow. Start the music now." I took a slow, shuddering breath and forced my fingers to release their death grip on the metal counter. My legal mind was screaming to secure the perimeter and halt the physical destruction of my real estate asset. However, a deep, primal instinct told me the performance was not quite over. The trap needed to snap shut at the absolute height of their arrogant delusion. "Hold your position, David," I instructed, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Let us see what my stepmother is doing." I reached past him and manipulated the keyboard, switching the primary monitor to the high-definition camera positioned in the historic great room. This massive space featured a stunning floor-to-ceiling fieldstone fireplace that my grandmother Clara had always kept immaculately clean. The camera feed flickered and adjusted to the bright lighting, revealing a scene that made the blood freeze entirely solid in my veins. My stepmother Brenda was standing in the center of the room, holding a large crystal wine glass. She was aggressively directing two catering assistants who were dragging several heavy plastic storage bins out of the hallway closet. I recognized those specific storage bins instantly. They did not contain old curtains or outdated decor. They were the most sacred, deeply personal items remaining in the house. One bin held every single childhood photograph of me and my grandmother, documenting the only moments of genuine love I experienced growing up. The other bin contained Clara original handwritten recipe books. Those fragile pages were filled with decades of family history, marginal notes about baking temperatures, and small doodles she drew for me when we baked bread together on Sunday mornings. They were irreplaceable pieces of my soul. Brenda took a long sip of her wine and pointed a manicured finger at the roaring fire she had ordered the staff to build in the stone hearth. "This house looks incredibly old and absolutely depressing," she complained loudly, her shrill voice picked up perfectly by the hidden microphone. "Richard promised me a modern, luxury estate, and all I see is dusty, sentimental garbage cluttering up my new entertaining space. We are clearing out this entire closet right now to make room for my designer coat collection. Toss it all into the fire." The catering assistants hesitated, exchanging uncomfortable glances. One of them, a young man with a name tag, reached into the top bin and pulled out a thick, leather-bound photo album. "Ma'am," he said politely, showing her the embossed cover. "These look like personal, family photographs. Are you entirely sure you want us to dispose of them this way?" Brenda snatched the album directly out of his hands. "I said get rid of it!" she shrieked, her face twisting with ugly, spiteful arrogance. "The girl in these pictures was a pathetic mistake, and the old woman who owned them is dead. I am the lady of this house now, and I decide what stays and what burns." I sat paralyzed in the surveillance van, watching my stepmother open the heavy leather album. Without a single ounce of hesitation, Brenda ripped a handful of glossy photographs from the binding. I saw the flash of a picture capturing my 7th birthday. I saw a Polaroid of my grandmother hugging me after my middle school graduation. Brenda crumpled the irreplaceable memories in her fist and tossed them directly into the roaring flames of the stone fireplace. The edges of the photographs curled and blackened before disintegrating into gray ash. Next, she reached into the second plastic bin and pulled out a faded green notebook. It was Clara's primary recipe book, the one she used to teach me how to read when I was just a little girl. Brenda flipped through the handwritten pages, mocking the elegant cursive script, before tossing the entire book into the center of the fire. The dry vintage paper ignited instantly, sending a bright orange flare up the chimney. She laughed, sipping her wine, as my family history literally went up in smoke. The cold, calculated patience that had driven my legal strategy all day completely evaporated. The disciplined senior litigation partner who meticulously gathered bank fraud evidence vanished. What replaced it was an absolute freezing and blinding rage. They had forged a deed. They had stolen $600,000 from a federal bank. They had mocked my career and occupied my home. I had maintained my composure through all of those financial crimes because money and titles could be easily recovered through the judicial system. But burning my grandmother's handwritten letters and destroying the only photographic evidence of my happy childhood memories crossed a boundary that no courtroom could ever repair. Brenda was erasing my existence from the very house Clara had gifted me. She was destroying the physical proof that I was ever loved. I stood up inside the van, my chair scraping loudly. The air felt electrically charged. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the certified, irrevocable trust documents along with my gleaming senior partner badge. I slipped the badge into the breast pocket of my tailored suit, ensuring it was highly visible. I turned to face Special Agent David. David looked back at me, waiting for the final confirmation. The blue light from the surveillance monitors cast a harsh, illuminating shadow across his focused face. I gave him a single, sharp nod. "Execute the warrants," I said, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth or hesitation. "Shut this entire circus down right now!" David immediately grabbed his secure radio headset. "All units, this is command. We have a green light for immediate breach. Target location is the primary brownstone. Secure all exits and maintain absolute perimeter control. We are moving in." The surveillance van erupted into synchronized, highly disciplined action. The two technicians at the communication consoles began rapidly typing, locking down the digital perimeter, and coordinating with the National Bank Fraud Division to initiate the hard freeze on Richard and Jamal newly acquired joint accounts. David unclipped a thick manila folder from the metal wall rack and handed it directly to me. "We need a final verification on the federal warrants before we step foot on that property," he instructed, maintaining absolute procedural integrity. I opened the folder. Inside rested the culmination of my grandmother legal protection and my own meticulous investigation. The federal magistrate judge had signed off on every single page with undeniable authority. The charges were listed in bold black ink: federal wire fraud, federal bank fraud, conspiracy to defraud a financial institution. The warrants authorized the immediate physical apprehension of Richard and Jamal, the freezing of all associated banking assets, and the full seizure of any personal property purchased with the stolen funds. It was flawless. Every legal requirement was met. The trap was ironclad. "The paperwork is perfect," I confirmed, handing the heavy folder back to him. "Let us go take back my house." David slid the heavy side door of the van open. The crisp, freezing Boston night air rushed into the cabin, biting sharply at my cheeks. I stepped out onto the historic cobblestone street. I took a moment to adjust my clothing. I was not wearing the casual weekend attire of a defeated, submissive daughter. I was wearing my sharpest, most intimidating charcoal gray designer suit. The tailoring was impeccable, specifically designed to project absolute authority in elite federal courtrooms. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my heavy, brass, senior partner badge, pinning it securely to my lapel. The polished metal gleamed brightly under the dim, amber glow of the vintage streetlights. This badge represented years of grueling education, relentless hard work, and my hard-earned position in the legal hierarchy. It was the ultimate shield against their arrogant delusion. Down the narrow street, the silent approach of the local Boston Police Department began. 4 marked cruisers glided smoothly around the corner, their headlights completely turned off, running entirely dark to avoid alerting the party guests prematurely. 2 black tactical vehicles pulled up directly behind them, their heavy tires gripping the pavement. Over a dozen federal agents stepped out onto the street, wearing dark windbreakers with large yellow letters reading FBI across the back. The sheer scale of the strike team was breathtaking to behold. This was not a simple noise complaint or a basic civil eviction process. This was a highly coordinated, large-scale federal raid on a massive financial conspiracy. David walked up beside me, quietly adjusting the heavy gear on his tactical belt. "We will secure the rear garden entrance and the side alleyway first," he explained in a hushed tone. "Nobody leaves the premises until we verify their identity and ensure they are not attempting to smuggle out any stolen antique heirlooms or digital evidence on their mobile devices. You stay right by my side during the initial breach." I nodded, falling into step with the federal tactical team. We marched down the historic street in a tight, highly disciplined formation. The heavy boots of the federal agents striking the wet cobblestone created a rhythmic, deeply intimidating sound. As we approached my grandmother's estate, the thumping bass of the party music grew significantly louder. The heavy masonry of the brownstone actually vibrated with the obnoxious pop songs Britney had selected for her fake influencer celebration. Warm yellow light spilled out from the tall bay windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the manicured front lawn. Through the glass, I could easily see the silhouettes of the elite guests, holding their expensive champagne flutes, completely oblivious to the massive law enforcement presence rapidly surrounding the building. They were laughing, networking, and happily toasting to Jamal's fabricated tech empire. They had absolutely no idea that the very ground they stood on was entirely legally secured by the woman they thought had been permanently kicked out onto the streets. The tactical units moved swiftly into position. 6 armed officers peeled off from the main group, rushing silently toward the wrought iron gate that led to the back garden. They took up defensive postures by the rear patio doors, ensuring that Richard and Jamal would have absolutely no route of escape when the panic inevitably started. The remaining agents, including David and myself, stacked up directly in front of the massive double mahogany front doors. I stood right at the front of the tactical formation. I wanted to be the very first thing my stepfamily saw when their artificial world collapsed around them. I wanted them to look at my tailored suit and see my senior partner badge shining in the light and realize, in one horrifying instant, that they had vastly underestimated the wrong woman. David looked at me, raising his hand to signal the final countdown. "Are you ready for this, counselor?" he whispered. I thought about the forged quitclaim deed. I thought about the predatory $600,000 bank loan. I thought about Brenda casually tossing my precious childhood photographs directly into the roaring fireplace just minutes ago. The burning anger inside me crystallized into an absolute freezing resolve. "I have never been more ready for anything in my entire life," I replied. David gave the tactical signal. The Boston police officers reached out and gripped the heavy brass handles of the double mahogany doors. The music blaring from inside the parlor reached a deafening crescendo. The fake laughter of the wealthy guests echoed loudly through the thick wooden panels. I stood incredibly tall, squaring my shoulders, my certified legal documents clutched firmly in my left hand. The time for hiding behind hidden surveillance cameras was officially over. It was time to step directly into the light and bring the entire federal hammer down upon their heads. The heavy mahogany doors yielded instantly under the forceful push of the tactical officers. I did not wait for them to secure the entryway. I stepped straight through the threshold, marching directly into the center of my grandmother Clara historic foyer. The transition from the freezing Boston night into the stifling heat of the crowded housewarming party was incredibly jarring. The massive parlor was absolutely packed with Boston socialites, wealthy venture capitalists, and Britney obnoxious internet friends. A rented sound system was blasting heavy bass music that shook the delicate crystal fixtures. For exactly 2 seconds, no one noticed the heavily armed federal agents stacking up in the doorway behind me. I caught the eye of the private catering manager standing near the audio equipment. I gave him a single, sharp, cutting motion across my throat. He took one look at my icy expression and the tactical vests moving into the shadows behind me and immediately reached for the main power cord. He yanked it straight out of the wall socket. The obnoxious party music screeched to a sudden, violent halt. The sudden, deafening silence was absolute. Dozens of elite guests froze mid-conversation, lowering their expensive champagne flutes and turning their heads toward the front entrance. The room of investors and influencers fell completely dead silent as their eyes landed on me standing there in my tailored designer suit. The crowd slowly parted, creating a wide, clear path through the center of the historic parlor. Standing at the far end of the room, near the fireplace where my childhood photos were just reduced to ash, was my stepmother Brenda. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury when she recognized me. She set her wine glass down so hard that the stem nearly snapped. She marched aggressively across the expensive Persian rug, her designer gown swishing violently around her ankles. She clearly thought I was just the defeated, submissive daughter, crawling back to beg for a few dollars. "Who let this pathetic dropout in?" Brenda screamed, her shrill voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. Her face was flushed red with arrogant indignation. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, completely oblivious to the federal agents standing silently in the shadows of the foyer. "Security!" she yelled, waving frantically toward a hired guard standing near the kitchen. "Throw her out into the street immediately! She has absolutely no right to be here ruining our private celebration!" I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground, looking at her with absolute, freezing contempt. I let her voice hang in the dead silent room, allowing every single wealthy guest to witness her true toxic nature. Brenda marched up until she was mere inches from my face, her heavy perfume making me physically nauseous. "Get out of my house right now!" she hissed through clenched teeth, her eyes wide with psychotic rage. My brother-in-law, Jamal, stepped out from a group of confused investors. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, clearly trying to look like a wildly successful tech billionaire. He strutted forward with that familiar, arrogant swagger, ready to play the role of the protective strongman. He positioned himself next to Brenda, puffing out his chest. "Look, Natalie," he said, his tone dripping with extreme condescension. "We told you to stay at a cheap hotel. You cannot just crash an elite business networking event because you are jealous. Let the security guards escort you out before you embarrass yourself further in front of my high-level investors." My father, Richard, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He was holding a glass of expensive bourbon, looking completely exasperated by my sudden appearance. "Natalie," he barked, his voice tight with warning. "We gave you direct orders to stay away. You are humiliating this family. Turn around and walk out that door immediately." I looked at the three of them standing shoulder to shoulder, a united front of greed, arrogance, and absolute delusion. They truly believed they held all the power. They believed their fake quit-claim deed made them invincible kings and queens of Beacon Hill. The time for playing the weak and broken daughter was officially over. I reached into the breast pocket of my charcoal gray suit. I pulled out my heavy brass badge, the one that identified me as a senior legal authority. I held it up high, catching the bright light from the crystal chandelier above us. The polished metal gleamed sharply, instantly drawing the eyes of every single investor and socialite in the room. The arrogant smirks on the faces of Richard, Jamal, and Brenda faltered slightly, replaced by a sudden creeping sense of severe confusion. "I am not a low-level paper pusher," I announced, my voice ringing out clearly and powerfully across the dead silent parlor. "I am a senior partner in real estate litigation at the most prestigious law firm in this entire state. I handle federal property fraud for breakfast." I unclasped the heavy leather briefcase I held in my left hand. I pulled out the thick stack of original, certified, irrevocable trust documents. They were heavy-bound with legal seals and stamped with the unmistakable mark of the state registry. I stepped forward, closing the final distance between us, and slammed the massive stack of legal documents violently onto the glass coffee table right in front of Jamal. The loud crack of the heavy papers hitting the glass made several guests jump backward in sheer shock. I locked eyes directly with Jamal and my father. My gaze was absolutely merciless. "And you two brilliant financial masterminds just mortgaged an irrevocable trust that you do not actually own," I declared, my voice laced with pure, lethal venom. The color instantly drained from Jamal's face. His arrogant posture collapsed like a deflated balloon. Richard stared at the heavy legal documents, his eyes widening in raw terror as reality hit him completely. The raw terror in my father's eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. Before either could formulate a pathetic excuse, the rhythmic sound of combat boots echoed across the polished floor. Special Agent David stepped from the dark shadows of the grand foyer, fully into the bright light of the historic parlor. Half a dozen heavily armed federal agents moved in absolute synchronized precision right behind him. The bright gold shields on their tactical vests flashed brilliantly under the crystal chandeliers. Federal Bureau of Investigation David announced, his voice booming with undeniable authority. "Nobody moves. Stay exactly where you are." The wealthy venture capitalists and Boston socialites backed away, raising their hands in sheer panic. The investors, who had just been listening to Jamal pitch his fake technology startup, scrambled backward, knocking over expensive catered appetizers in their desperate haste to distance themselves from the center of the room. The housewarming party instantly transformed into a massive federal crime scene. I turned my sharp gaze toward the terrified investors, making sure my voice carried to every single corner of the room. "I want everyone to understand exactly who you are dealing with tonight," I declared, holding up the fraudulent quitclaim deed for the entire room to see. "These two men did not just suddenly invite you here to celebrate a new real estate acquisition. They invited you here to participate in an active criminal conspiracy. They broke into my grandmother's house and forged this legal document to steal her property. But their greed did not stop at simple state-level forgery." I looked directly at Jamal, who was now physically trembling. I listed their exact crimes with merciless legal precision. Forgery, federal bank fraud, wire fraud. They used a fake signature to extract a fraudulent $600,000 equity line of credit from a national bank. They routed those stolen funds across state lines this very morning to pay off illegal loan sharks and fund an imaginary technology company. The murmurs of shock and disgust rippled through the crowd of elite business professionals. The managing director of the venture capital firm, who had been talking to Jamal just minutes ago, looked absolutely violently sick. "You pitched me a fraudulent syndicate?" the investor shouted, his face turning bright red with intense fury. "You were trying to steal my capital to cover a federal bank heist." Jamal completely lost whatever tiny scrap of arrogant masculine pride he had left. The fake billionaire tech brother persona evaporated into thin air. He looked at the federal agents moving toward him with silver handcuffs, and he completely broke down. Jamal dropped to his knees right there on the expensive Persian rug and started sobbing hysterically like a terrified child. His expensive custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a ridiculous Halloween costume. "It was not my idea," Jamal screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my father. "He told me it was completely legal. Richard made me do it. He said we could just sign the paper and take the bank money. I did not know it was a federal crime. He lied to me. He made me file the application." Richard turned the color of chalk. The mighty, patriarchal head of the family, the man who had spent his entire life looking down on my career, was suddenly rendered completely speechless. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came out. His absolute betrayal by his favorite son-in-law left him paralyzed. Special Agent David stepped right up to my father, grabbing his arms and violently spinning him around. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly, echoing with a sharp metallic snap that signaled the permanent end of Richard's freedom. "You have the right to remain silent," David stated coldly, pulling the restraints tight. "I highly suggest you start using it right now." An agent hauled Jamal up from the floor, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists, while he continued to weep and beg for a deal. Across the room, the consequences of their massive greed began striking the rest of my toxic stepfamily. An agent approached Brittany, who was standing frozen near the hallway, clutching her phone. "Ma'am," the agent said formally, "the federal government has officially frozen all banking accounts associated with your husband and your father. Your personal credit lines are currently locked pending the ongoing financial investigation. Brittany let out an ear-piercing shriek of pure agony. The reality of having absolutely zero money hit her instantly. "My cards are locked," she wailed, staring at her phone screen in sheer panic. "How am I supposed to buy groceries? How am I supposed to pay for my car? You cannot just take all my money. You have to fix this right now." She dropped her expensive phone onto the floor, realizing that her days of free luxury were gone forever. She looked toward her mother for help, but Brenda was already facing her own catastrophic downfall. My stepmother stood near the roaring fireplace, where she had just burned my precious childhood memories. The realization that she was completely bankrupt, that her husband was going to federal prison, and that her entire fake, wealthy socialite identity was permanently destroyed, finally crashed down upon her shoulders. The wealthy wives she had been trying to impress mere minutes ago were now staring at her with blatant disgust and absolute pity. Brenda let out a pathetic whimpering sound. Her knees gave out completely. She collapsed straight down onto the polished hardwood floor, ruining her expensive designer gown. She buried her face in her hands, thoroughly humiliated in front of the entire Boston elite society. I stood tall in my tailored suit, watching the federal agents drag my father and my brother-in-law out the front door. The absolute destruction of their fake empire was completely flawless. I smiled coldly as the red and blue police lights illuminated the dark street outside. The flashing red and blue police lights painted the walls of the parlor, creating a chaotic strobe effect across the shattered remains of my grandmother artisan lamp. The elite venture capitalists and wealthy socialites who had filled my home just moments ago were now scrambling for the exit in sheer terror. Nobody wanted their reputation tied to a major federal fraud bust. Men in expensive suits shoved past each other to reach the front door, abandoning their coats and briefcases in their desperate rush to escape the federal agents. Women in designer dresses tripped over the cobblestone steps outside, sprinting toward their luxury vehicles. They left their half-empty champagne flutes resting on my antique tables, completely desperate to distance themselves from my disgraced family. I watched the mass exodus with intense satisfaction. My father Richard and my brother-in-law Jamal were forcefully dragged through the remaining crowd. The heavy steel handcuffs locked their wrists securely behind their backs. Jamal was still openly weeping, begging the arresting officers to let him call his private investors to explain the misunderstanding. The officers ignored him completely, shoving him into the back of a marked tactical cruiser. My father looked absolutely hollowed out. As the agents guided him down the stone steps, he turned his head and locked eyes with me one final time. He looked like he wanted to apologize, or perhaps beg for mercy, but the federal agent firmly pushed his head down and forced him into the back seat of the police vehicle. The heavy car doors slammed shut, sealing their fates. With the criminals removed from the premises, I turned my attention to the two women still cowering inside my foyer. My stepmother Brenda was still sitting on the hardwood floor, staring blankly at the massive mess the fleeing guests had left behind. My half-sister Brittany stood nearby, shivering in her sequined party dress, clutching her useless cell phone. The realization that their stolen luxury lifestyle was permanently over had finally paralyzed them both. I walked over to the entryway table, where my father had arrogantly thrown that forged quitclaim deed just yesterday morning. I picked up the fake document and ripped it straight down the middle, letting the torn pieces flutter to the floor. Then I reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I walked over to Brenda and dropped the cash directly onto her lap. "You need to leave my property right now," I commanded, my voice echoing loudly in the suddenly empty house. Brenda looked up at me, her makeup running down her face in thick black streaks. "Natalie, please," she whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. "All of our bank accounts are completely frozen. We do not have access to a single cent. We cannot even afford a hotel room tonight. Where are we supposed to go? I looked down at her, feeling absolutely zero sympathy. You can try an Uber, I replied coldly, repeating the exact same dismissive advice my family loved to give when someone else was suffering. Take your daughter and walk out that front door before I have the remaining officers arrest you for trespassing. Brittany let out a loud, dramatic sob, wrapping her arms around herself. You are a monster, she cried. You planned this whole thing just to ruin our lives. You set us up. I did not force your husband to commit federal bank fraud, Brittany, I stated sharply. I just made sure he got caught. Now take your $20 and get off my property. The two women slowly gathered their coats. They walked out of the brownstone, moving like ghosts, completely stripped of their arrogance and their stolen wealth. I closed the heavy double mahogany doors behind them and locked the deadbolts securely. The massive historic house was finally entirely quiet. For the first time in my life, I was completely alone, and it felt incredibly wonderful. Over the following days, my phone rang constantly. The caller identification displayed numbers originating from the county detention center. Richard and Jamal were desperately trying to reach me from jail, begging for legal representation and demanding that I drop the charges. They clearly still did not understand how federal law operated. I was not the one pressing charges against them anymore. The United States government was handling their prosecution, and the federal prosecutors were incredibly eager to secure maximum convictions for the massive bank fraud. I ignored every single frantic and tearful phone call. I blocked their numbers and instructed my law firm to reject any communication attempts from their defense attorneys. I had absolutely no mercy left to give. Instead of wasting my energy on their legal drama, I focused entirely on reclaiming my space. I hired a specialized historical restoration crew to repair the damage Jamal had inflicted on the parlor walls. We carefully patched the plaster and sourced authentic 19th century mahogany wainscoting to match the original wood. I spent hours scrubbing the hardwood floors, cleaning up the scuff marks and the spilled wine left behind by their awful housewarming party. The physical labor was intensely therapeutic. With every room I cleaned, I felt like I was washing away decades of their toxic influence. I slowly unpacked my belongings, organizing my books in the library and arranging my clothes in the master bedroom. I found genuine peace in the quiet, empty spaces of the large estate. The brownstone was no longer a symbol of my family greed or a battleground for their ridiculous egos. It was a beautiful, secure fortress that belonged entirely and legally to me. Every evening, I sat in my grandmother's favorite reading chair drinking a cup of coffee and watching the sunset over the Boston skyline. The heavy, suffocating weight of desperately trying to earn their impossible approval was permanently gone. I had completely protected my family legacy and safely secured my independent future. Fast forward 8 months, and the federal justice system delivered exactly what I had meticulously engineered. I took a single morning off from my firm to sit in the back row of the federal courthouse, observing the sentencing hearings. Richard and Jamal wore matching orange jumpsuits instead of their expensive, tailored clothing. They looked completely broken, stripped of their arrogance and their fake status. The federal judge showed absolutely zero leniency for their massive financial conspiracy. Richard was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. The judge explicitly condemned his willingness to exploit a federally insured institution to fund a luxury lifestyle. Jamal received an even harsher sentence of 10 years due to his previous predatory loan activities and his role as the primary architect of the corporate shell game. He sobbed openly when the gavel banged down, finally understanding that his slick, tech entrepreneur persona meant absolutely nothing inside a federal penitentiary. The financial fallout was swift and entirely merciless. Federal investigators immediately seized and liquidated Jamal's fake technology startup to pay off the massive restitution orders. Every single piece of leased office equipment and every fake corporate asset was auctioned off to the highest bidder. Brenda was left completely defenseless against the mounting credit card companies and the aggressive private lenders. Without Richard to continuously fund her insatiable shopping addiction, she was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The bank seized her luxury vehicles and auctioned off her designer handbag collection. She was forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment in a neighborhood she used to openly mock. The most poetic justice of all fell squarely onto my half-sister Brittany. The moment the local news outlets reported the federal indictments, her entire social media empire collapsed overnight. Her followers turned on her viciously, completely disgusted by the revelation that her lavish house tour videos were filmed inside a stolen property funded by a massive bank heist. Her brand sponsorships were instantly terminated. With her husband in federal prison and her mother entirely bankrupt, Brittany had no choice but to face actual reality. She was forced to take a minimum wage retail job at a local shopping mall, folding clothes and ringing up customers just to afford her basic rent. The woman who once complained that my historic brownstone was too ugly for her internet channel was now wearing a polyester uniform and answering to a teenage shift manager. I drove past her store once, simply observing from a distance. I felt absolutely no pity watching her clean the fitting rooms. She was finally doing some honest hard work for the first time in her entire life. Back in Beacon Hill, my life transformed into a beautiful picture of absolute peace and quiet triumph. I sipped my coffee, letting the quiet stillness of the morning wash over me completely. I am sitting in my fully restored historic parlor right now, holding a warm cup of black coffee. The morning sunlight catches the beautiful mahogany wainscoting that my specialized contractors meticulously rebuilt. I found an exact replica of my grandmother Clara's stained glass artisan lamp at a private auction, and it sits proudly on the side table, casting colorful light across the room. My career at the law firm has skyrocketed. Exposing a massive federal fraud ring gave me a fierce reputation in the legal community. My client roster is completely full, and I am highly respected by the senior partners. I go to work every day knowing my legal expertise is a weapon I know exactly how to use. I return home every evening to a quiet, secure sanctuary that belongs entirely to me. There is a toxic lie that society pushes on us, especially on women. People will tell you that family is everything. They will claim that blood relations demand unconditional forgiveness, no matter how terrible the offense. They expect you to swallow your anger, smile politely, and let toxic relatives trample all over your boundaries just to keep the peace. I am here to tell you that family is absolutely not a free pass for abuse, theft, or disrespect. Sharing a genetic link with someone does not give them the right to treat you like collateral damage in their own greedy schemes. When people show you their true colors, you need to stop making excuses for them. You need to stop shrinking yourself to make them comfortable. Richard and Brenda spent my entire life trying to make me feel small and inadequate. They used Jamal and Brittany to try and steal the one beautiful thing my grandmother left me. They thought my love for family would make me a passive victim. Instead, they met a senior litigation partner who knew exactly how to lock the cage they built for themselves. They thought they could outsmart the legal system, but they only outsmarted themselves. I did not ruin their lives. They ruined their own lives through their unchecked arrogance and bottomless greed. I simply stepped back and provided the perfect documentation for their self-destruction. The ultimate victory is not just about getting revenge or putting criminals behind bars. It is about reclaiming your own self-worth. It is about looking around the quiet, safe life you built with your own two hands and knowing nobody can ever take it away from you again. I am 33 years old, thriving in my career, living in a multi-million-dollar estate, and I have never been more at peace. My grandmother Clara would be incredibly proud of the woman I have become and the legacy I have protected so fiercely. Have you ever let toxic family members dig their own graves before handing them the shovel? Have you ever stood back and watched the karma they earned finally catch up to them? Share your story in the comments below. I would love to hear how you protected your own peace and stood up to the people who underestimated you. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories about setting absolute boundaries and taking your power back.